There are many ways of torturing someone just using water. One of the worst that I have heard of is the water dungeon. There are multiple variations of the water dungeon torture, but the common element is prolonged water immersion. The victim is usually forced into some sort of cage. The cage is then lowered into a pool of filthy water up to their neck. Then they are simply left there. Often the room is pitch black and freezing cold. It doesn't take long for the body to cool down. Soon they are shivering and miserable, but this is only the beginning of their torment. The cage itself is designed to maximize the torture of the submerged individual. Sometimes the walls of the cage are lined with spikes, meaning the prisoner has to concentrate all their attention on staying upright in the center of the cage. Any lapse in concentration would send them floating painfully into one of the spiked cage walls. Another equally evil cage design is the Cramped confinement cage. This cage is too small for the prisoner to stand up in, but with water up to their necks, they cannot sit down or else they will drown. Instead, the victim is forced to assume a painful half-squatting position in order to keep their head above the water. Tom Abraham was captured by Vietnamese soldiers and forced into a 3-foot-high cage, then submerged up to his neck in pond water. In his book, The Cage, he writes about his experience. I feel the lukewarm water rising about my crouching body as the cage sinks. Panicking, I grab the bars above my head with both hands. As it slowly sinks deeper into the water, I am forced to crane my neck to keep my face above the surface. The sky is darkening. As the night thickens, the air is filled with mosquitoes. They dance around my face. I duck under the water when it becomes intolerable, but within a second or two of resurfacing, they return. I'm getting cold. I start rubbing my body to keep warm. My neck is aching from the strain of keeping my face above the surface. I'm so thirsty that I can't resist gulping a little water, though I know I shouldn't. If I catch dysentery now, I'll probably die. I mustn't drink anymore. In the middle of the night, I find to my disgust that there are leeches trailing from my neck. I rip them off, tearing my skin as I do so. The worst thing is not being able to stand or sit straight. At first, it is no more than uncomfortable. Gradually, my body begins to ache, and as time passes, the ache swells into the most intense torment. I writhe within the confines of the cage, like a fish suffocating in a net. All this pain was caused by a single night spent in the cage. Now imagine if you were kept like that for days, even weeks. Falun Gong practitioners describe being tortured in this way by the Chinese government. The prisoners were submerged in water for extremely long periods of time. One of the most disgusting aspects of this torture is the fact that the victim would have to urinate and defecate into the water that they were standing in. Sometimes, more than one prisoner was confined in the same cage, further increasing the amount of waste that they were floating in. Sometimes the guards would throw snakes and rats into the water. This was to terrify the prisoners, as the hungry animals would often attack them. But soon the animals would die in their filthy sewage, and so their decomposing corpses would further add to the stench and filth of the water. Prisoners would not be given fresh water to drink. Instead, they would be forced to drink the water they were stood in. The water, contaminated with shit and piss and dead animals, would give them uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, which in turn made the water even more contaminated and undrinkable. After a few days of being submerged in water, human flesh starts to become soft and breaks down. Their skin becomes like wet tissue paper. The slightest movement can cause the flesh to break open. Soon, the submerged prisoner is covered in painful sores all over their body. This is made worse by the dirty water. The sores are attacked by bacteria and become massively infected. Each sore becomes a festering wound. Soon, along with the sewage and the dead rats, the water becomes even more disgusting, as it becomes contaminated with the pus and blood and rotting flesh of your own body. On top of all this is the sleep deprivation. During the whole ordeal, sleep is impossible, as any lapse in consciousness means the prisoner will drown. Throughout the whole ordeal, the prisoner must remain awake and fully aware of their pain and suffering. In 1999, Miss Ding Yan was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment in a Chinese prison. Towards the end of her sentence, after years of torture, God stripped Miss Ding naked and locked her in an iron cage with spikes on all sides. They submerged the cage in dirty water up to her neck. The area was kept completely dark. Miss Ding died in September 2001 after enduring months of the water torture. In 2001, Mr. Kang Hong and 12 other Falun Gong practitioners were imprisoned by the Chinese government and subjected to the water dungeon torture. There was no light in the water dungeon at any time, and there were even dead rats and snakes in the cell in addition to the sewage water. The cage was less than a person's height, and the practitioners were handcuffed to the top of the cage. As a result, they could neither stand up nor sit down. The practitioners had to defecate and urinate into the water. The torture lasted 7 to 15 days. When Mr. Kang was taken out of the dungeon, his whole body was contorted, and the lower parts of his body had festered. He was paralysed for the next few days. The water dungeon is just one of innumerable ways in which man will inflict inhuman suffering on his fellow man. I will be covering many more horrible torture methods in future videos, so if you haven't lost all faith in humanity yet, stay tuned for more videos about the extremes of human cruelty. Until next time, goodbye.